What we're talking about today is a huge task, a huge scale of task facing the UK over the next, over many decades to come, but a very immediate need to step up the spend on infrastructure spending. And I think if we look at the political parties, yes, there are differences, but at the end of the day, we're probably all quite practical people. There is a job that needs to be done here in terms of the massive uplift in infrastructure spend, and there is a significant gap in terms of funding. So the government's own figures, which were released at the time of the budget in the strategy document of Infrastructure UK, the new body set up to take a long-term view of infrastructure planning in the UK, which I think is probably very welcome to everybody in this room that this has been done to set up this body. But the government's own figures indicate some 400 billion needing to be spent over the next decade, 40 to 50 billion pounds per annum up until 2030, in fact. So a huge uplift from the 30 billion pounds which has been spent per annum over the last 5 years. So moving from 150 billion over the last 5 years, really to 400 billion over the next decade. And that massive increase is replicated in different parts of the infrastructure sector. And so energy, for example, the spend on energy, and we're all familiar with the issues here, is really going to double the rate of infrastructure spend needed over the last 10 years, is going to double over the next 5 to 10 years. The government makes a distinction between what it calls economic infrastructure and other types of infrastructure. So economic infrastructure is defined as energy, transport, waste, water and communications. And that is really where those figures apply. So those figures of 30 to 40 billion pounds, 40 to 50 billion pounds a year apply purely to those sectors. But of course, we're all familiar with the Building Schools for the Future, the huge programme of the Homes and Communities Agency, so schools, housing, all of the hospital building programme. Those are not included in those figures. So those continue, and the need for that continues in addition to the so-called economic infrastructure. And why is the economic infrastructure so important? Because of its capacity and because of its quality, the need for it to be resilient, really, to impact on the economic progress of the country. So what we're talking about here is the infrastructure that underlies the future success of the country in terms of economic growth, international competitiveness, national security and the terrorist threat, and all of the climate change agenda. So infrastructure really underlies all of the key aspects which drive government policy, but also the quality of life for us as individuals. And I know there's a lot of people here today from local authorities, and there we're much more talking about the sort of total place agenda. And we're going to have Peter Gilroy, the Chief Executive of Kent County Council, talking us through the progress they've made as one of the leading total place pilots. And total place bringing together local infrastructure development with service transformation and really moving away from the vertical spend of government departments and the what used to be called the lack of joined-upness between central government departments and local government, a huge factor in terms of the current political debate on efficiency in public expenditure. But of course, that is just the background. The real issue we're here to talk about today is how will it be funded? There is a huge gap in terms of the provision of equity capital at the moment. The capital markets are effectively still closed from the recession. What used to underpin a lot of PFI projects in terms of the capital spend was the monoline insurance wrap. That has really declined significantly. So there's opened up a huge gap in terms of the provision of commercial debt through the banks and access to the capital markets to fund infrastructure projects. And that is still an ongoing issue. And I don't think the government has yet really addressed that issue of how to bring back the capital markets into funding infrastructure projects. And of course, if we look across the piece, yes, the establishment of the Green Investment Bank, which was announced at the budget is certainly a step forward because it gives the ability potentially to fund green projects which cannot compete commercially in the funding markets. But the scale of investment announced, 1 billion from asset sales and another billion from the private sector, 2 billion in total is all that's been announced against the 400 billion need that I set out a few moments ago. And of course, the funding issues in those 5 or 6 major economic infrastructure sectors that I mentioned differ enormously. So we've got a very complex range of funding mix in areas like transportation. We've got the whole sort of public capital area. We've got the role of user funding. And if you look at projects across the piece, for example, the Nottingham Tram, where there's been a debate about user funding, to what extent can you put in place business parking charges and so forth. There is a continuous debate about user funding, the TIF programme in Manchester. To what extent is it acceptable to charge users for funding? Secondly, you've got the conventional capital procurement and all of the issues that go with that. You've got the PFI side, which has obviously gone through huge turmoil over the last few years and which certainly Labour appear to be committed to in one form or another going forward. The Conservatives are saying they're not proposing to sort of endorse PFI as such, but one suspects that there is going to be something very similar to PFI, which is going to emerge under a Conservative government through TIFU and through Infrastructure UK and so forth. So the need is going to be there. And then, of course, in the utility sector, there is the whole role of private finance and economic regulation. And that brings you into operational efficiencies, which sort of takes you back to total place. So it's really saying if you have an RPI minus X regulatory regime, as you do in the electricity sector with the distribution assets, for example, that drives down costs. It drives down the cost of capital. It forces operational efficiencies on the electricity companies. What can we learn from that model in terms of some of the major infrastructure projects that we've talked about in transport and other areas? So there are some interesting but very complex issues underlying the funding side. So we start with the scale of the problem. We then move on to the scale of the funding task and the issues there. We put in issues like regulation, and we put in issues like total place and driving out efficiencies from the public sector. Then we have to look at the international competitiveness of the UK and the fact that capital is competing for where it should go. So if we talk about the electricity industry, it's largely owned by the Spanish, the French and the German companies. They have a choice where they put their investment. Why should they put it into the UK unless the policy, unless the regulatory regime favours them to do so? They can put that investment into other areas around the world. So I think an interesting debate we're going to have today. We've got some very interesting speakers. We are going to cover the national dimension, the local dimension, and the international dimension. So I think we are going to get a very good representative flavour across all of the areas. And I hope we're going to come up with some answers, because that's what we intended when I think the conference was designed, really, was to come up with an agenda, very much like Tom, I think, is going to talk about now, which we can engage with government on. And I think anybody who's talked to government ministers or shadow ministers over the last month or so knows that they desperately want to engage on these issues with the private sector and the public sector, because they need to have the ideas coming forward. And I think that will be very much the case over the next few months.